What happens when a father's thirst for revenge festers in the darkest corners of his soul for 10 years? A man driven by an insatiable desire to make those who wronged him pay. And when the time finally comes, the results are nothing short of a nightmare. This isn't just any story. This is the tale of a man who spent 10 years in prison, biding his time, plotting his revenge. 10 long years, all leading up to a single moment. And when he finally got his chance, the world would never be the same. John Matthews was once an ordinary man, a father, a husband, someone who believed in the law, believed in justice. But that belief shattered when he learned the horrifying truth. His daughter, his only child, had been violently assaulted by two men who wore the badge. The very people who swore to protect her, to protect him, had taken everything he loved and destroyed it. It was a crime that should have shaken the city, but instead, it was buried. The officers involved were given a slap on the wrist, and John, left in the wake of his daughter's trauma, could do nothing but watch as the system he trusted failed him. For a decade, John waited. Behind the cold, gray walls of his prison cell, he sat, his thoughts consumed by one thing: revenge. It wasn't enough to know the men who'd hurt his daughter were still walking free. He couldn't live with the idea of them untouched, unaffected. He could never let go of the fact that his daughter would have to face the world knowing that no one had paid for what they had done to her. So, John made a decision. He would wait. He would wait until the perfect moment to strike. He would wait for them to think he was gone, for them to think they had escaped justice. He would wait until the time was right. And when that moment came, he would make them regret ever thinking they could get away with it. But what happens when a man holds on to rage for that long? When a father's love turns into something darker, something more dangerous? How much of a person's soul is left after years of vengeance eats away at it? Before we continue, think about this. What would you do if someone you loved was violently hurt by those who were supposed to protect you? Would you wait for the slow wheels of justice? Or would you take matters into your own hands? If you were John Matthews, would you have waited, or would you have done what he did? As we explore what led John Matthews to take the law into his own hands, we begin to see just how far someone is willing to go when pushed to the edge. His journey is a reflection of not just revenge, but of the failures of a justice system that is supposed to protect the very people who need it most. The truth of what happened to John's daughter is tragic. But the aftermath? That's where the real story lies. Because while John was waiting in prison, while he was plotting and preparing, something else was happening in the background. Something that would change the course of everything. Something even John couldn't have predicted. The police force, those who were supposed to serve and protect, were not just witnesses to a crime. They were complicit in it. And as John prepared to make them pay, he didn't realize that the very system he was trying to take down would collapse under the weight of his vengeance. A twist no one could have foreseen, not even John himself. What happens when justice fails? When those who are meant to serve the law are the very ones who break it? And what do you do when the system leaves you no choice but to take matters into your own hands? John Matthews' story is one of rage, revenge, and a father's desperate need to make things right, no matter the cost. But as we unravel the full extent of his actions, the emotional toll it took on him and his family, and the tragic consequences of his decisions, we'll see that some wounds run so deep, no amount of vengeance can ever truly heal them. And the twist? Well, that's something you'll need to stay with us for. It's a revelation that will make you question everything, because sometimes the story you think you know isn't the one that ends up being told. So, stick with us. What you're about to hear is more than just a tale of revenge. It's a look at how far one man would go to make the world pay for its wrongs. But what he didn't expect is that, in the end, the price might be higher than he ever imagined. If you find this story interesting and want to hear more like it, go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe. We're here to bring you true crime stories that uncover hidden truths that you will love to watch. The crime that shook a small community occurred in a dark alley late at night. It all started with a phone call to 911 that would set the stage for a murder that had been 10 years in the making. A call so calm, so deliberate, it seemed almost rehearsed. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice crackled through the line. I need to report a body, the voice on the other end said, low and steady, almost too calm for the gravity of the situation. It's near the abandoned warehouse on Willow Street. You'll find him there. The line went silent. Seconds later, the dispatcher processed the information and dispatched officers to the scene. And what they found there would haunt the community for years. As the officers arrived, the smell of gasoline lingered in the air, thick and sharp, mixing with the cold night breeze. The streets were eerily quiet, except for the faint screech of tires from a distant car and the low hum of approaching sirens. It felt like the calm before the storm. Nothing was quite right. The silence, the cold air, the thick smell of gasoline. Everything about that night felt like it was teetering on the edge of something monstrous. The officers cautiously approached the back of an abandoned building, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Then, as they rounded the corner, they saw it. A body lying motionless on the cold, unforgiving concrete. At first glance, the scene didn't seem to make sense. Officer Roberts, one of the two men involved in the case that had become infamous in this city, was sprawled on the ground, his eyes wide open, staring into the void. His uniform, once crisp and clean, was soaked in blood. But it was what was beside him that made the officers stop in their tracks. A broken bottle of gasoline, a few scattered matchbooks, and in the dim light, a single note, scratched onto a piece of crumpled paper. The officers immediately recognized the significance. Roberts was one of the two men who had wronged the Matthews family years ago. He had been part of the cover-up, part of the very system that had failed John Matthews and his daughter. And now, he was dead, murdered in cold blood. The scene screamed of vengeance. It was calculated, deliberate. This wasn't a random murder. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was the result of a decade-long wait, of a man who had bided his time, letting his anger simmer, his plan take shape in the shadows. The note found next to Roberts made that clear. John Matthews had finally come for them. But what made this case so different, so chilling, was that it wasn't just a crime. It was a culmination. A decade of waiting, plotting, and preparing for a moment that was always just out of reach. John Matthews had made sure everything was in place. And when he struck, he did so with precision. The officers immediately secured the area, calling in the forensics team. But as they looked down at Officer Roberts' lifeless body, they couldn't help but wonder, how had this happened? How had it gone so far? The investigation was launched immediately. But with every passing hour, the question on everyone's mind grew bigger. Who was behind this? And why now? The police force, once confident in their own safety, found themselves questioning their own morals. They'd seen crime. They'd seen violence. But this wasn't just any murder. It was the act of a man who had lost everything, a father who had been pushed too far, a man who had seen the very people meant to protect his daughter destroy her without consequence. And now, that man had made them pay. The investigation into Roberts' death quickly turned into an investigation into the events that led up to it. What was the motive? Why had John Matthews waited so long? And as detectives dug deeper, they found themselves entangled in a web of lies, cover-ups, and betrayal, things they never could have imagined. The deeper they went, the more they realized that they were dealing with a case far more complex than a simple act of revenge. What John Matthews had done was far from impulsive. It was methodical. And it was all part of a larger plan that no one had seen coming. But it didn't end with Roberts' death. Just days after the murder, the second officer involved, Officer Daniels, was found in his apartment, dead from a gunshot wound to the head. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't a random attack. It was the same cold, calculated execution that had taken Roberts' life. And just like that, two men who had once thought they were untouchable were dead. But the mystery deepened. Was this the end of John Matthews' quest for vengeance? Or was there more to come? As the police pieced together the evidence, they realized that the murders weren't just about revenge. They were about exposing a system that had failed. The murders were meant to make a statement. And it wasn't just the officers who were targets. John Matthews was targeting the very foundation of law enforcement itself, exposing the cracks in a system that was supposed to be trusted. But what no one expected was the final twist. The investigation revealed that John Matthews wasn't working alone. He had help, an unlikely ally who had spent years gathering information, who had worked quietly behind the scenes to ensure that every move Matthews made would be executed without flaw. And when the truth finally came out, it was something that no one saw coming. In the end, John Matthews' plan wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about making sure that the people who had wronged his family never forgot the cost of their actions. It was about making a statement that would echo far beyond the small community. A statement that would shake the foundations of justice and force the system to reckon with its failures. And even though the officers were gone, and justice had been served in the most extreme way possible, the question remained, was it enough? John Matthews' story is one of deep pain, one of a father driven by love and vengeance, but also one of a system that failed him, failed his daughter, and failed every person who trusted the law. What had begun as a quest for justice ended in tragedy, not just for the officers, but for everyone involved. And in the end, no one walked away unscathed. John Matthews was a man who had once known love, purpose, and family. He had been a devoted father, a man who would go to any lengths to protect his daughter, Emily. But the day his world shattered was the day he discovered that not even the law could shield his precious girl from harm. A man who had once lived for the quiet moments of joy with his family now found himself in a world of darkness, where vengeance became the only thing keeping him going. John's life hadn't always been filled with tragedy. Before everything went wrong, he had been a proud man, a working-class father who raised his daughter in a small, close-knit town. Emily was everything to him. She was his heart, his reason for everything. As a child, she was innocent, full of dreams and laughter, always thinking about the future. She wanted to be a doctor, to help people, to make a difference. But that future was violently ripped from her, and John's world collapsed into an abyss. Emily had grown into a young woman full of promise, and for a brief moment, it seemed like nothing could touch her. But that promise was broken the day she crossed paths with two of the most trusted figures in the town, the officers who were meant to protect her, but instead became her worst nightmare. Her name was Emily Matthews. She was 22 years old, bright-eyed and determined to make her mark on the world. But her future came to an abrupt halt when Officer Roberts and his partner, Detective Harris, crossed her path during what should have been a routine traffic stop. Emily's only crime had been driving home after a late night out with friends, but the encounter quickly escalated. Roberts and Harris, two men with a reputation of being tough but fair, decided to make an example of her. What happened next was a brutal crime that would forever haunt the Matthews family and the town. Emily was taken into custody under false pretenses, accused of a crime she did not commit. What followed behind the walls of that police station would forever remain a silent, painful secret. The officers, using their power and position, took advantage of Emily in ways that no one should ever have to endure. And when she tried to speak out, they silenced her, using their influence to cover up their crime. What happened to Emily was never officially documented. No evidence was found. No charges were filed. The town moved on, and Emily was left broken. Her trust in the very system that was supposed to protect her shattered. But not everyone had moved on. John Matthews knew something was wrong. When his daughter returned home, She was not the same young woman who had left that evening. She was broken, silent, haunted. Her eyes held a darkness that no father could ever imagine seeing in his child. John could never forget the night she came home. Her tear-streaked face, her quiet whispers about the officers, the men she had once believed were there to protect her. He tried everything to get her to speak more, but Emily would not. Her trauma had locked her voice away, leaving her to struggle in silence. John vowed that if anyone ever found out what those men had done to his daughter, he would make sure they paid for it. But when he tried to seek justice, when he tried to confront the system that had failed his daughter, he was met with walls. No one would listen. Not the district attorney. Not the mayor. No one. And when Emily finally tried to report what happened, the officers had already covered their tracks. Her accusations were dismissed as the ravings of a mentally disturbed young woman. John Matthews was no fool. He knew the power these men held, and he knew that he had nothing to protect him in his fight for justice. So, when he found himself framed for a crime he did not commit, a crime that landed him in prison for 10 years, he lost everything. His life, his freedom, and the last vestige of hope he had for redemption were all taken away. But while he was behind bars, one thing kept him alive: his promise to Emily. It was there, in the cold confines of a prison cell, that John's thirst for vengeance began to grow. He would spend 10 long years watching the world pass him by, knowing that his daughter was out there, still broken, still suffering. And the officers who had ruined her life, Officer Roberts and Detective Harris, were still walking free, still wearing their badges as though nothing had ever happened. The rage inside him burned with a slow intensity, growing stronger with each passing day. As for Roberts and Harris, they had long since become pillars of the community, trusted lawmen with years of service. Officer Roberts, a man in his late 40s, was the epitome of a cop everyone thought they could rely on. He had a wife and kids, and his reputation was beyond reproach. No one suspected that behind his friendly smile and confident demeanor, he harbored a dark side, a side that, once exposed, would show just how far he would go to cover up his own crimes. As Detective Turner sought the truth, he realized that there was no simple explanation for what had transpired. John Matthews wasn't just out for revenge. He was seeking redemption, the justice he had been denied for so long. And as the layers of the story unraveled, Turner found himself grappling with a difficult question. Was John Matthews truly a criminal, or was he a man who had been pushed too far by a system that failed him, just as it had failed his daughter? This wasn't just a case about murder. It was about the darkness that can take root in a father's heart, the anger that festers when the system that is supposed to protect you becomes the one that destroys you. John Matthews was a man who had spent his entire life working hard to provide for his family. He wasn't wealthy, but he had enough to give his wife and daughter a good life. Emily, his only child, was a bright young woman with dreams of becoming a doctor. She had just started her second year of college when everything changed. It was a warm summer evening when Emily was driving home after dinner with friends. She had done nothing wrong. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't intoxicated. But when the blue and red lights flashed behind her, she did what every law-abiding citizen would do. She pulled over. The officers who approached her car that night were Officer Roberts and his partner, Detective Harris. They had been patrolling the area looking for a so-called suspect that fit no real description. To this day, there is no record of what happened next in the official police report. What we do know is that Emily never made it home the same. What happened inside that police station was a nightmare. But worse than the crime itself was the cover-up that followed. The officers made sure there was no evidence left behind, no video footage, no body cam recordings. They had done this before. They knew how to make a case disappear. When Emily finally spoke to her parents, she was a shell of the girl she used to be. She wouldn't say much at first. But John knew. A father always knows when something is wrong. Days passed, then weeks. Emily refused to talk. She stopped attending school. She barely ate. Her mother, Linda, was frozen in fear, unable to help her own daughter. And John? He tried everything. He filed complaints with internal affairs, reached out to lawyers, even tried going public. Nothing worked. The police department circled the wagons. The town turned against him. Everyone believed the officers over the word of a broken young woman. But John wasn't going to give up. He started pressing harder. He began uncovering things about the police force: corruption, abuses of power, missing case files. But before he could get too close to the truth, something happened that would seal his fate. One night, John was arrested. The charge? Aggravated assault. The victim? Officer Roberts. The evidence? A fabricated statement, planted DNA, and a corrupt system that wanted him silenced. John was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and in the process, he lost everything. By 2013, John had been in prison for 5 years. 5 years of anger, regret, and helplessness. He had lost touch with Emily. His wife had divorced him. The world had moved on, but John's pain never faded. Then, one day, he received a letter. It was from Emily. It had been years since he last heard from her. When he opened the envelope, his hands shook. Inside was a short, chilling message. "Dad, I can't do this anymore. They won." John read those words over and over again, his mind racing. What did she mean? Was she giving up? Was she in danger? The next day, John tried to call home. No answer. That night, he found out the truth. Emily was gone. She had taken her own life. By the time John was released from prison in 2018, he was no longer the same man who had entered 10 years earlier. He had spent a decade preparing, waiting, thinking. He had nothing left. No wife, no daughter, no home. The only thing he had was a promise. A promise that Roberts and Harris would pay for what they had done. John spent the next few months planning. He moved carefully, staying off the radar. He knew that if he wanted to get justice, he couldn't afford mistakes. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because it wasn't just John who wanted revenge. There was someone else. And this is where the case takes on a whole new dimension. On the night that Officer Roberts was found dead, the police assumed it was a straightforward case of revenge. But what they didn't expect was the second body. Detective Harris, found in his home, shot execution style. At first, everyone assumed it was John. But as the investigation continued, something didn't add up. John had a solid alibi for Harris's murder. He hadn't pulled the trigger. So who did? The police began to dig deeper, and what they uncovered would shock even the most hardened detectives. Emily wasn't the only victim. Roberts and Harris had done this before. And there was someone else out there. Someone who had also lost everything. Someone who had been watching, waiting. Someone who had decided that justice couldn't wait any longer. Just when things seemed to fall into place, new evidence came to light. It turned out that a second unknown figure had been trailing Roberts and Harris for months. Someone who knew their habits, their routines. Someone who had been gathering evidence of their past crimes. Detective Turner, the lead investigator on the case, was the first to put the pieces together. And what he discovered changed everything. This wasn't just a revenge killing. This was a reckoning. Roberts and Harris had been part of a network of corrupt officers who had been preying on vulnerable women for years. They had a pattern, a system, and someone had decided that it was time to put an end to it. John may have set the stage, but someone else had taken it further. Was it another victim's father? A fellow inmate John had met in prison? Or someone within the police force itself? As the investigation continued, Detective Turner found himself questioning everything. Because the deeper he dug, the clearer it became. The corruption in the police force ran far deeper than anyone had realized. John wasn't just fighting for his daughter. He had been fighting against an entire system that had failed not just Emily, but countless others. And in the end, the truth was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. The final twist? Roberts and Harris weren't the last to die. Because once the truth started to come out, those who had kept the secrets hidden knew they had only one option: silence everyone involved. And what followed was a bloodbath. More bodies, more cover-ups, more lies. John Matthews had started something far bigger than he ever intended. And by the time the dust settled, no one, not the victims, not the criminals, and not even the police, would ever be the same again. In the end, the case left behind more questions than answers. Who was truly responsible for the killings? Was John the mastermind, or was he simply caught up in something even darker? And most importantly, was justice truly served? Or was this just another story of vengeance spiraling out of control? One thing is for sure. By the time it was over, no one in that town ever trusted the badge again. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from the system. Sometimes it comes from the people who have lost everything. And in this case, justice came at a price no one was prepared to pay. The investigation began when Officer Roberts' body was discovered in an isolated alley just outside town. His lifeless form sprawled across the cold concrete. There were no signs of a struggle, no defensive wounds, nothing that indicated a desperate fight for survival. It was as if Roberts had walked into the killer's trap willingly. His gun was still in its holster, his badge intact. Nothing about the scene suggested a robbery, a hate crime, or even a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. It was eerily clean, almost like the murderer had planned every detail with chilling precision. The police immediately questioned the nature of the crime, and speculation ran wild. Was this a revenge killing? A message to the police force? Or perhaps a botched gang-related hit? But none of it added up. No leads, no witnesses, no signs of the killer's presence except the body and the faint smell of gasoline in the air. Detective Turner, the seasoned investigator assigned to the case, felt the weight of the unknown pressing on him. He knew that every piece of evidence, no matter how small, was crucial. As he walked through the scene with his team, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that this wasn't a random crime. The timing was too perfect. The location, too deliberate. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. But the real breakthrough came when the investigators started to focus on the victims' connections. Roberts wasn't just any officer. He was a trusted member of the force, with a history of handling high-profile cases. He had been involved in cases that shook the town, and his name had surfaced in the investigation of Emily Matthews' assault all those years ago. Could there be a connection between the murder and the events that transpired a decade earlier? As Detective Turner dug deeper, he uncovered something he hadn't anticipated. Roberts had kept a detailed journal, one that seemed to track not only his day-to-day activities, but also a series of cryptic notes about people who had crossed him. And among the names listed was one that Turner hadn't expected to see: John Doe. It was the first real lead, but it raised more questions than answers. How was this possible? John Doe, the father, was locked away in prison, serving time for a string of lesser offenses that seemed unrelated to his current predicament. Turner's gut told him that this was more than coincidence. But how could John have orchestrated the murder from inside a prison cell? In his search for answers, Turner uncovered something even more bizarre: a phone that Roberts had kept with him at all times, encrypted with multiple layers of security. At first, it seemed like a dead end. Each attempt to break into the phone led nowhere, until one night, after weeks of frustration, a breakthrough came. A hacker who specialized in encrypted files was brought in. The moment they cracked the code, the phone's contents revealed a list of names, none of them ordinary. The list included lawyers, judges, and high-ranking police officers. But one name stood out above the rest. It was Detective Harris, Roberts' partner. Turner's stomach turned. If Roberts' own partner was involved in this, the entire case would unravel in ways no one could predict. He couldn't help but wonder if his own colleagues were tangled in something far more corrupt than just this murder. But the twists didn't stop there. As Turner spent sleepless nights poring over the encrypted phone, he made another startling discovery. Photos. At first glance, they appeared to be simple snapshots, but upon closer inspection, Turner realized they were of Emily Matthews. Some of them were taken long before the assault, when she was just a teenager. But others? They were recent. And worse yet, they were taken from the very surveillance cameras that were supposed to protect the public. Emily had been under surveillance by the police. Not just one or two officers, but the entire department. It was as if someone had been keeping track of her every move, as if they knew something was coming. What had they been planning? The more Turner uncovered, the more he realized the full scope of this case was beyond anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just about a father seeking revenge. It was about a system that had failed so completely that the desire for justice had festered into something far darker. Something no one in the department could have ever imagined. As the days passed, the investigation took its toll on Turner. The pressure was mounting, but it wasn't just the case that was weighing him down. Turner couldn't escape the fact that his own colleagues might be involved. Harris, the very person he had trusted and worked alongside for years, was now a suspect. His thoughts were conflicted, torn between his duty as a detective and his loyalty to the badge. How could he have missed the signs all these years? At night, Turner would lie awake, replaying every conversation, every interaction, trying to find the one thing that would make it all make sense. But the more he tried to connect the dots, the more fragmented the case became. He couldn't help but feel that he was chasing ghosts, that no matter how hard he worked, the truth would always be just beyond his reach. Despite his growing doubts, Turner pressed forward, determined to bring justice to Emily, to find out who was responsible for her suffering, and to uncover the truth behind Officer Roberts' death. But as he got closer to the truth, the lines between right and wrong began to blur. And the deeper he went, the more he realized that sometimes the pursuit of justice comes at a cost that could destroy everything he thought he knew about the system he had sworn to protect. The investigation into Roberts' murder was no longer just about finding a killer. It was about exposing the darkness that lurked behind the badge, the corruption that had poisoned the very people who were supposed to be protectors. Turner knew that bringing the truth to light would shake the foundation of everything he believed in. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for what that meant. The toll this case took on Emily's family was immeasurable. For Emily's mother, the pain of knowing what happened to her daughter was compounded by the helplessness of not being able to stop it. She had always known that her daughter was a bright and ambitious young woman, full of life, full of potential. But that all changed the moment those officers, Roberts and Harris, took her daughter's future into their hands. They stole more than just her innocence. They took her freedom, her sense of security, and, for a time, her ability to trust the world around her. John, Emily's father, had been imprisoned long before this incident, locked away in a place where he couldn't protect his daughter, couldn't prevent the horrifying events that were unfolding on the outside. The day he found out about Emily's assault, the day he learned what those officers had done to his daughter, was the day his world collapsed. He had trusted the system. He had believed in it. But the moment the truth came to light, it became clear. The system had failed them both. For John, the anger that simmered for years inside him turned into something uncontainable. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about something deeper, something primal. The father inside him could not accept the reality that the people entrusted to protect had been the ones to cause his daughter's suffering. He had lost faith in the very institution that he had once served, an institution that had betrayed his trust, and worse, it had betrayed his daughter. John's quest for revenge was calculated and deliberate, but it was also driven by raw, guttural emotion. He didn't just want to hurt those responsible. He wanted to make them understand the depths of the pain he had experienced. For years, he had waited, planning, biding his time, learning everything about the officers involved. And in those 10 years, his hatred for the police grew, not just because of what happened to Emily, but because of the system's failure to acknowledge the crime. To him, the murder of his daughter wasn't just a betrayal of family. It was a betrayal of everything he had ever known. But we can't just sympathize with John. Yes, he sought revenge for his daughter's pain. But at what cost? His actions led to the deaths of two men, two cops who had families of their own. Officers Roberts and Harris, despite their flaws, weren't just faceless villains in this narrative. They were human beings with lives, families, and responsibilities. Roberts had a wife and two young children. Harris, a father of three, had a family that was left to pick up the pieces after he was killed. It wasn't just their lives that ended that night. It was the lives of the people who loved them. Was it worth it? Could anything justify the deaths of two men, regardless of the evil they had done? For John, the answer seemed clear. He had lost everything: his daughter's innocence, his trust in the law, and perhaps even his own sense of who he was as a father. But for Emily's mother, the question loomed larger. Would any amount of revenge ever bring her daughter's life back? Could a father's pain ever be justified by the death of another? As we dive deeper into the story, we start to question the motivations of the police officers involved. They weren't born monsters. They weren't always the people they became. At some point, they had dreams of justice, of serving their community, of protecting the innocent. But something went wrong. Something dark twisted their sense of duty. Were they driven by power, or was it simply a series of bad decisions that spiraled out of control? Officer Roberts had been known for his integrity. He had a reputation for being diligent, for following the rules. At least, that was the public perception. No one saw the cracks beneath the surface. No one saw the way he began to justify his actions, the way he turned a blind eye to the things he should have reported. Did he know what he was doing was wrong when he helped cover up Emily's assault? Or had his need to protect his own position clouded his judgment? Detective Harris, on the other hand, was a man driven by fear. Fear of losing his place, of being caught in a web of corruption that had long been spun around him. He had always been part of the good old boys club, always had a knack for finding shortcuts. The world had opened doors for him because of who he was, and that made him blind to the consequences of his actions. Did he ever realize how far he had fallen? Did he ever wonder if it was worth it? Or had he become so entangled in the lies that he couldn't find his way back? The more Turner dug into their pasts, the more he saw how easily anyone could be caught up in this web. Power, privilege, and corruption weren't just things that happened to bad people. They were things that had seeped into the fabric of the system, like a slow poison, slowly rotting away at the core of law enforcement. Roberts and Harris weren't evil for the sake of evil. They were human beings who made mistakes. Tragic mistakes that led to a loss that could never be undone. In the end, the truth about what happened that night wasn't as simple as a father's revenge or a murderer's guilt. It was about the complex, intertwined lives of everyone involved: the family, the perpetrators, the investigators, and the system itself. Everyone had a role to play, whether they wanted to admit it or not. And in the search for justice, the line between right and wrong blurred until it was impossible to tell who the real victims were. For Emily, the scars of what happened to her would never fade, no matter what. For John, the revenge he sought might have given him a sense of closure, but it didn't bring back his daughter's innocence. And for the people left behind, the families of Roberts and Harris, there would never be any real justice, only the lingering question of whether anything could ever justify the loss of a life. Sometimes, in the search for truth and justice, the cost is higher than we can imagine. And sometimes, the people who are supposed to protect us end up becoming the ones who hurt us the most. The night of the murder, John knew exactly what he was doing. He had spent 10 years preparing for this moment, meticulously planning every detail. He had mapped out the perfect crime, a way to avenge his daughter without leaving a trace. The silence of the night provided the perfect cover for his act of revenge. And as he stood there, gun in hand, watching Officer Roberts walk into the alley where he would meet his fate, there was no hesitation in John's mind. This was the moment he had waited for. 10 long years of anger and frustration about to be realized in the cold, hard reality of the trigger pull. What no one could have predicted, however, was how John planned to get away with it. In the days leading up to the murder, he had orchestrated an intricate diversion, setting up a series of alibis and false trails. He knew the police would be looking for a suspect close to the scene, someone with a clear motive. But what John had done was craft the perfect web of deceit, placing himself out of reach, making it appear as if he were miles away when Roberts was killed. His meticulous attention to detail had ensured that the murder looked like an act of random violence, something the police would struggle to connect back to him. And for a while, they did. As the investigation unfolded, the police launched a manhunt for the killer, convinced that this was no ordinary murder. The brutality of the crime, the precision with which Roberts had been killed, pointed to someone with a personal vendetta. The detectives scoured the city for any leads, piecing together witness statements, cell phone records, and security footage. But the deeper they went, the more it seemed that their suspect was slipping through their fingers. The case was becoming a maze, every turn leading to a dead end. Detective Turner, who had been called in to investigate the murder, was quickly drawn into the complexity of the case. He began to question everything: the motives, the timing, the evidence. Turner's instincts told him there was something more to the case than met the eye. But what he didn't realize was that the truth about John's involvement would be exposed in a way no one could have expected. It wasn't until they uncovered a series of encrypted messages on John's old phone that the truth finally began to surface. The messages, hidden away in a secure folder, painted a chilling picture of a man who had been preparing for this moment for years. But what shocked Turner the most was the revelation that John hadn't been working alone. There were whispers of other people involved, other families affected by the officer's actions. John's quest for revenge had not only been personal, it had become part of something much larger, something darker, involving people who had suffered at the hands of the same corrupt system. The investigation turned into a race against time. Just when the police thought they were closing in on John, a twist in the investigation led them in a completely different direction. It wasn't just about him anymore. The case was tangled in a way no one had anticipated. As Turner dug deeper, he uncovered more victims, other families who had fallen prey to the same officers, their lives forever changed by a system that should have protected them. The web of corruption was much wider than anyone had imagined. In the end, justice was served, but at a heartbreaking cost. John was caught, his elaborate plans unraveled in the face of a relentless investigation. He was taken into custody, his life forever changed by the actions he had taken. But was it truly justice? For John, there was a bitter satisfaction in knowing he had avenged his daughter's pain. The thought of Emily's suffering had driven him to this point. Her memory fueled his every step. But when he stood there, behind bars, the weight of his actions began to sink in. Was this what he had hoped for all along? Was this truly justice? Or had he simply become part of the never-ending cycle of violence and revenge? Emily's mother was left to mourn the loss of her daughter, her heart broken beyond repair. Her pain, though, was mixed with a sense of helplessness. What could she do in a world that allowed such horrors to happen? She had lost her daughter to the brutality of those who were meant to protect, and now she had lost her husband to the same vengeance that had consumed him. She was left to face the empty silence of their home, the quiet reminder of everything that had been taken from her. John, for all his resolve, could never undo the damage that had been done. The life he had once known, one of hope and possibility, was gone. The revenge he had sought had come at a price so high, it left him with nothing but a hollow sense of victory. He had made the ultimate sacrifice for his daughter, but in the process, he had sacrificed his own humanity. But what about justice? Was the truth ever truly served? Or had it just been another tragedy, another senseless death in a world that seemed unable to escape its own darkness? The questions lingered long after the case was closed, as the families left behind were left to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives. What do you think? Was John justified in his actions? Do you believe there's ever a point where revenge is deserved? Or does it always lead to more harm? Was his quest for vengeance an act of justice? Or was it just another tragedy in a world gone wrong? If you found this story shocking and thought-provoking, share it with your friends to start the conversation. What would you have done if you were in John's shoes? Would you have sought justice or taken matters into your own hands? If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You don't want to miss the next one.